Good morning, everyone. I feel like I want to say well done. It's a rainy day. You got here. Well done. Not a mean feat. I remember with small children, that was always my dread, to try and get to church with wet children. But maybe you've managed it better than I did. I have a confession to make as we begin. And this confession is linked to where we have been this week. So we've had our own mini Exodus this week as clergy. We've all, most of us have gone off to Derbyshire for a clergy conference, and clergy are quite boring people, really. They don't have an awful lot to talk about. So we talked about what we're doing this Sunday, and I said to people, I am preaching this Sunday on Genesis, and then went on to describe the story of Exodus as their faces changed, and then they went, Exodus? So I do these things quite often in my head. I'm saying one word and from my mouth I'm saying another, and that's because I'm very dyslexic. So if I do that, just nod and smile and bless me from where you are and know that that's what's going on. I love these stories. I remember them from childhood. I remember them from nursery, from Sunday school. Does anyone remember them from Sunday school? Lovely. Now, I asked this question at the 9 o'clock and the answer was no. Did anyone learn the song that included all of the 10 plagues of Exodus? No? Oh. Well, I'm very glad. Frankly, it's quite gory and a little bit brutal, so I think it's good that we didn't. I have to say, when I was in Sunday school, I used to listen to these stories and think, these are really weird. And what do they have to do with Jesus? And so that's one of the things that we are going to be thinking about today. What does this incredible story from Exodus reveal to us about God and about Jesus? And also, what does this story suggest to us about how God may be at work in our lives today? So let's start with a summary of where we've reached so far. We have a summary of Genesis, and that starts with God creating everything, and we are told over and over again that it is good. God creates us for relationship and with one another and with God. And we are told through the story of Noah that God will make all things new and redeem us and the whole earth. And that's a thread that goes right through, as we see, to the end of Revelation, where the book of the Bible that talks about the whole earth being renewed and reclaimed. And God promises that through Abraham, all nations will be blessed. And last week, Si reminded us that our promise is a promise that is signed, sealed, and delivered. And if you're hearing this song in your head, thank God we're not listening to it today. It is part of the story of Jesus in the Old Testament. And of course, we learn more about Jesus in the New Testament, but it is not that the New Testament replaces the Old Testament. It is that it builds on that great story of Jesus throughout all of time and all of history. Tom brought us this visual aid in his sermon when he invited us onto this Bible course together of the infographic Bible. We see all the threads of how the Bible links together into the great story culminating in Jesus. And Jesus reminds us himself in Matthew 5, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them. I have come to fulfill them. This is a story of real people like you and me. We have a video. If you're not familiar with that tune, it comes from EastEnders. And the reason I thought that was so fitting is because if you've ever watched EastEnders, they never leave. They're just stuck in the square. And here we have God's people stuck in Egypt. So let's have a little summary of where we begin in Exodus. We begin, frankly, with a brutal story of enslavement and genocide. Pharaoh is so afraid of the Israelites' power because there are so many of them, he has decided to cull the Israelites by killing their baby boys so that they cannot continue to reproduce and will ultimately die out. We're told that it's 430 years since Joseph brought the people into Egypt in order for them to flee famine and to be blessed. I love in our reading it says 430 years to the day. Very neat. And of course, at the end of Genesis, Joseph has settled his whole family and they are valued. And somehow in these 430 years, we've gone from that to slavery. We're told very early in this book, however, that God does not forget his people. He knows and he remembers and he cares. God heard their groaning and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. Enter Moses. Moses is born in the midst of genocide. His mother is so afraid and so keen to keep him alive that she places him in a basket and puts him on a massive river and hopes that somehow God will keep him alive. And by God's grace, he is found by the princess of Egypt and his mother is invited to come and look after him in the palace. And I imagine that she taught him about his people. As he grows up, he engages and notices the treatment of the Israelites, and he is so enraged that he finds himself losing his temper and murdering an Egyptian guard. Filled with guilt and with fear, he flees. And just as we have sung, God runs after him. I wonder how often we find ourselves choosing to run rather than to face a difficult situation. What are the situations we're facing right now that we would rather run away from? I'm not going to ask you to shout them out. As we explore this story, we are looking at stories that form the foundation of our understanding of God's determination to love us, to save us no matter what the circumstance, and to provide for our needs in the situations we find ourselves in. In my own life, there have been times when I have felt very trapped. I've experienced situations where there have been decisions that others have made that have caused me harm. I have certainly experienced times of wanting to run away and have indeed done that at times. And not just from the situation, but I've wanted to run away from God. The idea that the stories I learnt in Sunday school applied to me, it didn't make sense, and it didn't find a home in my soul until I understood how they were laying a foundation for all of the stories that culminate in Jesus. God remembers and builds on his promises. And I have also experienced him doing that time and time again in my life. And so I invite us to call to mind a moment when God's loving presence or his actions in our lives have transformed our situations. We can often forget. Life carries on, just like a river. This is a story of transformation and freedom. And there are three particular areas that we are going to look at in this. The first is that God takes his people from hopelessness to hopefulness. The second is that God takes his people from poverty to provision. And the third is that he takes them from uncertainty to covenant certainty. So first, God moves his people from hopelessness to hopefulness. Exodus is a story for when we are feeling trapped and hopeless and downtrodden, when we are wanting to run away and not face something, just like Moses ran away. God's people were enslaved, ill-treated, and being murdered. There are situations in our world today that reflect this. It is not an irrelevant story. It can't get more hopeless than that. And yet, in the midst of it, we see that God connects through a personal relationship, just as he did with Abraham, with an individual, and that is Moses. We've got a video now to show that moment.
Here I am. Take the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you stand is holy ground. Who are you? I am that I am. I don't understand. I am the God of your ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
You are born of my mother, Yocheved. You are our brother.
What do you want with me? I have seen the oppression of my people in Egypt, and have heard their cry.
Stop it! Leave that man alone!
So I have come down to deliver them out of slavery, and bring them to a good land. A land flowing with milk and honey. And so
It's a beautiful clip taken from The Prince of Egypt. If you haven't seen the film, I thoroughly recommend it. I think it's a really good telling of this story. Moses believes himself unredeemable, and yet God redeems him and uses him. There's certainly been times in my own life when I have felt unredeemable, and yet God actively reached out to draw me home. God's always going to do that. Moses ran away and God reached out and drew him back to his original calling for him. And if we sit here today feeling far from God and feel like that gap could never be bridged, God can bridge that gap. I love how, as Exodus goes on, God uses Moses' staff to demonstrate what he is doing. And as a shepherd, Moses' staff would have represented his life to him. Shepherds would make a notch on their staff to represent specific life events that had gone on. And every time Moses used his staff to show what God was doing, he was reminded that God was using his life, and God will use our lives too. Even though I am dyslexic, it's, I think, a gift because it means I think in a different way and I see the world in a different way and can draw things together in unusual ways. God uses Moses to free his people, and he protects them through Passover. He gives them a meal to share, a lamb is sacrificed to cover the Israelite houses with safety, and ultimately lead them to freedom. Sounding familiar at all? A life is given to protect another life. Now, there are 42 miracles in Exodus. 42. It's the book in the Old Testament with the most number of miracles. And they are all miracles that are performed to ultimately lead God's people to meet with and be welcomed by Jesus. We may feel unlovable, and yet we are completely loved. God reached into my life at a moment where I had run away to the farthest point, and he reached out just before he knew I would need him the most. What a gift. And we run away because we don't always trust what God is going to do. Not everyone wants to leave. Some of the Israelites are held back by fear of giving up what they know. Fear of the unknown is a powerful emotion. Picture your family home where you grew up. Perhaps it holds really fond memories for you. Or perhaps you are someone who's had to move from the place that you know and love. How easy was it to leave? I have some sympathy for the Israelites that they don't want to go. And certainly in our family, not all of my children have valued that my job has meant that we have moved around the country. Fear can hold us back from experiencing the fullness of the promises that God has for us. And there is always a choice. Even here there is a choice. Moses visits the Israelites before visiting Pharaoh and tells them of God's plan, and they choose to be involved. And as I met Jesus for the first time, there was a choice. I became a Christian at the communion rail at midnight mass, having said, no, I won't receive, I'll just have a blessing, thanks. And Jesus met with me and I heard his voice and he said, well, here I am. And it's real. And the choice was, so what are you going to do about it? God takes his people in Exodus from poverty to provision, from slavery to providing miraculously in the desert. When we are afraid and uncertain and thinking that we'd rather lean on our own sense of control, when we are uncertain of what God might be doing in our lives, remember that we have a God who can part waters. God can make a way where there is no way. And then there is celebration. The first thing that happens when the Israelites are freed is that they worship. Miriam sings praise to God. It's the first song of praise that we have in the Bible. It's in Exodus 15, and she says, I will sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. The Lord is my strength and my defense. He has become my salvation. He is my God, and I will praise him, my Father's God, and I will exalt him. We sang earlier, as long as I am breathing, I've got a reason to praise. And how powerful can worship be in reminding us of the provision that God has in our lives? We're called to celebrate the good moments, and we are called to celebrate in the difficult moments and the desert too. We are called to give thanks to God for his provision. Provision that we see in Exodus in the form of food in the desert. God provides manna. Now, it's interesting to notice, actually, that we are also told that the Israelites feel pretty hard done by at this point. And to be fair, they have gone through hell and back. They have been slaves. They have seen their children murdered. They've also lived through the plagues. They are now in a desert where there seems to be no provision at all, and not everyone is very happy. In Numbers, where we see some of the Exodus story played out as well, the Israelites complain and they are wailing and they say, if only we had meat to eat. And of course, God provides quail because he hears our prayers and answers. And then they say, we remember that we ate fish in Egypt at no cost. Also, the cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, and garlic. But now we have lost our appetite. We never see anything but this manna. God provides where provision seems impossible. And how often are we not happy with what he gives us? God has always provided for me. I can say that with absolute confidence, but rarely on my timetable. We're often okay with what God provides, but perhaps you sound a bit like me. You're like, thanks for that. But maybe, could we just add this bit in? Or could we do it like this? And often the way that God sees things is not the way that I see them. And yet, he wants to reassure us that he is providing for us. And so he writes it in stone for the Israelites. He moves the Israelites from an uncertainty of what he will provide to covenant certainty. This is where hope and provision combine. God brings the Israelites back to Mount Sinai, where Moses was called by God to save his people, and he brings his promises to fruition. It is a return. It is a fulfillment. It is the beginnings of a homecoming and redemption that will find its fullness in Jesus, and it has 3 parts. It has the law, the commandments, and other rules to live by, and through them God is saying, I will help you live with one another well. God provides the tabernacle, a tent that says, I am always with you. Every moment that you camp in this desert, I am with you. And he provides forgiveness through sacrifice. Passover, I will wash you clean. I will wash you clean through the life of a scapegoat. And Jesus is where that hope and provision combine into the fullness of all of these promises, all of this covenant promise. It began through Abraham, through whom all nations will be blessed. All of us, that's us folks. Jesus says, I fulfill the law. In Matthew 5, as we said earlier, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. Jesus promises, I will be with you. We go from God's presence in a tabernacle to a personal presence. Jesus says, destroy this temple and I will raise it again in 3 days. Jesus is our temple. Jesus says in John 4, yet a time is coming and has now come when true worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. Jesus promises us that God, through his spirit, will dwell within us, not some separate temple, but within us. Jesus becomes the sacrifice that redeems the whole world. Jesus is perfect. Where Moses is an imperfect liberator, Jesus perfectly liberates us. Where Moses loses his temper more than once and smashes the 10 Commandments, Jesus intercedes perfectly for us, being willing to carry all that is necessary, even his own cross. These are stories describing the staff of the great shepherd, Jesus, that tells us everything we need to know, that we are loved. Now, my life looks nothing like it would have done without Jesus in it. And God says, even to me now, but I am not done. I am not done. The story of becoming the person that God has fully created me and all of us to be, it takes a lifetime. The Israelites find themselves taking 40 years to travel what should have been an 11-day journey. God will go with us on all the twists and turns and the moments that we cling to our control. Exodus ends with freedom coming to fruition through his people stepping out in faith. Reaching our promised land is a lifelong endeavour. And Jesus says to us as we try to do that we can have hope. We need not fear. God will provide, even in desert times. God, through Jesus, will meet us where we are. And he promises, as he commissions all of us to our unique call, I will be with you always to the very end of the age. So as we come towards the end, and I invite the band to come up, where do we feel like we want to run away? Where do we experience trappedness or are afraid? God does not forget. He knows, he remembers, and he cares. If God can part waters, he can make a way where there is no way. And I invite us to remember our staff, the story of our life, what God has done or what he has promised to fulfill that maybe you've not really fully received yet. If you never ask God to reveal your story through his eyes, you will not see the beauty in the brokenness that he has created through you and will bring to perfection through your life. Our lives are weaved into this story through the sharing of communion, through worshipping together. We are part of this great story. And if there's something where you feel trapped or afraid or held back or like you're holding on to control and maybe you want to try giving it to God, we would love to pray with you. Please do come and take the opportunity to be prayed alongside. And if you've not come for prayer for a while, do it today. See what God wants to offer to you. Moses responds to God like this, and let us do the same. So I invite us to put our hands out.